Elias Cormick didn't speak much. Most in town said he'd lost the words the day his wife and baby girl died in that fire 8 years ago. Others whispered it was guilt that kept his mouth shut. Guilt for what happened that night, or maybe for what he'd done before. Either way, Elias kept to himself, running the ranch on the edge of town like a man, trying to work himself out of existence. His land stretched wide and wild, the kind of place where a man could disappear. Maybe that's why he stayed there. He wasn't cruel exactly, but there was a hardness in his eyes that warned people not to get too close. His foreman once said Elias wore grief like a second skin, tight, worn, and impossible to peel off. And though he was just 36, the gray in his beard and the permanent shadows under his eyes made him look older, weathered like the fence posts lining his fields. People gave him space, and he returned the favor. When the auction was announced, Elias hadn't planned on going. He hated town, hated the smell of greed that hung in the air during these so-called pauper sales. But something that morning pulled at him. Maybe it was a dream he couldn't remember. Maybe it was that silence in his chest that had grown heavier in the last month. Either way, he saddled his horse and rode in before the sun hit the rooftops. The girl was standing on a makeshift stage beside a red-faced man in a brown suit. She didn't look scared, which was strange. At 19, most girls would have been trembling, cheeks wet with shame. But she stood tall, arms folded behind her back like a soldier. Her dark hair was braided tight, her dress plain and worn, the edges frayed. Her eyes, though, her eyes weren't young. They were tired, flat, like she'd already seen too much. Elias recognized that look. He saw it in the mirror every morning. The man running the auction said her name was Maybelle Hart. Orphan, no known kin, brought from a church home 3 towns over after her guardians went broke. The way he spoke, you'd think she was a saddle or a plow horse. Sturdy, good for work, no defects. The bidding started low, and a few ranchers elbowed each other, tossing out numbers like they were playing cards. Elias didn't remember lifting his hand, didn't remember what price he paid. All he knew was the silence that followed when the gavel fell. The crowd parted like water when he stepped forward, eyes wide with something between fear and surprise. Because Elias Cormick never bought anything he didn't need. And no one believed he needed a girl. She didn't say anything as he led her to his wagon. She climbed it on her own, hands folded in her lap. She didn't ask questions. That silence between them, it should have been awkward, but it wasn't. It felt like something they both understood. Some people fill quiet with noise. Others learn to carry it. On the ride back, Elias glanced at her once, just once, and saw how she stared out at the horizon like she was counting the miles between her and something worse. The town talked for days after. Old men on porches, women at the mercantile. Some said he'd bought himself a wife. Others guessed she'd be working his fields like any other hand. But no one asked Elias directly. And Maybelle didn't come back to town. At the ranch, he set her up in the old bunkhouse. Told her she could stay as long as she worked. She nodded once and got to it. Mending, cleaning, feeding the horses. She was good with her hands and didn't complain. But there was a stiffness in her movements, like she was always waiting for something to strike. At night, Elias could see the lantern glow from her window long past midnight. Some nights he heard her whispering. Other nights he heard nothing, and that was worse. Elias didn't ask questions. Not at first, but he noticed things. The way she flinched when boots scraped against wood. The way she never turned her back when someone entered a room. And once, after a thunderstorm, he found her curled behind the hay bales in the barn, eyes wide, body trembling like a leaf. She didn't explain, and he didn't push. There was a brokenness in her that felt too familiar. He wasn't sure if that made things better or worse. Weeks passed. She learned to ride, learned how to shoot. Elias taught her, quietly, with patience he didn't know he still had. And she listened, always listening, always watching, never asking why. Then one morning, while loading feed into the wagon, Maybelle said something strange. "They'll come looking soon," she said, her voice low. Elias turned. Who? She didn't answer, just tied the feed sack tighter and climbed into the wagon like she hadn't said anything at all. That night, Elias sat on his porch, rifle across his lap. The moon hung low, casting long shadows across the land. He thought about what she said, thought about the thin scar along her collarbone he'd glimpsed once when her dress slipped, thought about the old bruises that hadn't come from falling off a horse. He knew then Maybelle wasn't just an orphan. She was running. From who? Or what? He didn't know. But he remembered enough of the world to know that whatever it wasn't far behind. And he also knew one other thing. He'd made a mistake bringing her here. Not because she didn't belong, but because someone out there believed she did. And they'd come to collect. In the dark, behind him, Maybelle's lantern stayed lit. He watched it flicker, a steady little flame in all that black. And deep in his chest, something that had been dead a long time stirred. Not hope, not yet, but something like it. The first to notice something was off was Amos Greeley. He owned the second largest ranch east of the hills, and he liked to think it meant something. Amos had money, influence, and a temper that everyone in town tiptoed around. He tried to buy Maybelle too, put in a higher bid, in fact, but Elias had raised his hand just seconds before the gavel came down. That small act, quiet as it was, had burned Amos in a way he didn't let go of. He didn't care about the girl, not really. But Elias had made him look like a fool, and Amos didn't forgive that kind of thing. A week after the auction, Amos rode out to Elias's place, under the pretense of checking in on some cattle drift. He didn't find any loose cows, but he saw Maybelle near the well, sleeves rolled up, shoulders tight. She glanced at him once, then turned back to the pump like he was just part of the wind. That kind of nerve from a girl with no name and no people, it stuck in his throat like dust. He tipped his hat, gave her a slow smile, but she didn't look back. Later, he'd tell himself there was something about her, something too proud, too calm. Like she wasn't scared enough, not for someone in her position. That look in her eyes wasn't submission. It was calculation. Then there was Harlan Kemp. He ran the general store in town and played dumb most of the time, but he was sharper than he let on. He'd sold Maybelle a few supplies, a needle kit, a tin of salve, and a small pocket knife, about 3 days after she'd arrived at the ranch. When she paid in coins, Harlan noticed one of them was an old Mexican peso. Rare out here. Too rare for a girl from a church home. He didn't say anything, but he remembered. Harlan remembered everything. He'd seen enough in his 40 years to know when someone's story had holes in it. He also knew Elias hadn't spoken more than a sentence to anyone in months. But now he came in every Saturday, quiet as always, just buying a few things. Always things a girl might use. Boots in a smaller size. Hairbrush. Cocoa powder. Nothing expensive, but thoughtful. Harlan didn't comment, didn't ask, but he filed it away. People only started buying comforts when they were trying to make something right, or keep someone from leaving. Meanwhile, Maybelle kept to herself. She worked hard, didn't start trouble, didn't spread gossip. But she was watching, always watching. And people noticed, even if they didn't say it out loud. She learned the way the land curved behind the barns, how the light hit the hills at sunset. She learned the names of the ranch hands, which ones drank too much and which ones watched her a little too long. And she learned about Mary Cormick, the wife Elias had lost. About the fire. About the rumors. One ranch hand, Lonnie, told her the whole story while they branded calves, like he couldn't stop himself. Said it was a cold night when it happened. Said the barn went up fast. Too fast. Some folks thought maybe it wasn't an accident. Maybe someone said it. But the sheriff found no proof, and Elias never answered questions. He just buried them both and stopped talking. Maybelle listened without a word. But that night, she stayed awake until dawn. Then there was Sarah Langley. She was the widow of a preacher, kept a boarding house near the edge of town. She used to cook meals for Elias and his wife, back when things were good. Sarah had always liked Elias. Liked him even now, though she'd never say it out loud. She believed people could come back from ruin, and maybe, deep down, she wanted to be the one who helped them do it. When she heard about Maybelle, Her stomach turned. Not out of jealousy, she told herself, but out of concern. It wasn't right, a girl being sold off like that. And it wasn't right, Elias taking her in, no matter how kind he might pretend to be. Sarah told herself she'd pay a visit just to check on things. But she didn't. Not yet. Something held her back. Something about the look on Maybelle's face when they passed each other in town. The girl didn't smile. She didn't seem afraid either. It was like she already knew what people were thinking and she didn't care. That unsettled Sarah more than anything else. Over the weeks, a quiet tension built around Elias's ranch like a storm cloud. Amos stopped by again, this time with a bottle of whiskey and too many questions. "How's the girl settling in?" he asked. Elias didn't answer, just stared at him until the silence did the talking. Amos smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You sure she's who she says she is?" he added before riding off. Elias watched him go with that same flat look he'd worn since the funeral. Back in town, Harlan got curious enough to send a letter to a contact he had up north. A priest who sometimes helped relocate orphan girls from overfilled church homes. It took 2 weeks for the reply to come back, and when it did, Harlan read it 3 times. There was no Maybelle Hart on any of their rolls. No one by that name had been sent south in the past year. That same week, one of Elias's Mares turned up cut across the flank. Clean slice. Not a wild animal. It could have been a warning or bait. Either way, Elias didn't tell anyone. He just fixed the wound and started sleeping with the rifle across his knees. Maybelle noticed. She also noticed the tracks near the fence line. 2 horses, both shod. Not ranch hands. She said nothing. Instead, she started stashing food in a small leather satchel under the floorboards of the bunkhouse. And Elias saw her do it. He didn't say a word, just stood there in the doorway one evening, arms crossed. She froze, hands still on the floor. The silence between them was like a hell breath. He finally said, "Expecting someone?" She looked him in the eye. "No, just being ready." "For what?" She hesitated. "In case you're not who you say you are." Elias nodded, like that was fair. But the truth was, neither of them had said much about who they were at all. That night, the truth sat thick in the air, just under the surface. Elias had never asked what she'd done before she got to that auction. And Maybelle had never asked why a man like him, broken, distant, carved out of silence, had bought her. They both carried secrets like scars. And maybe that was why they didn't press. But outside, beyond the hills, someone else was pressing. Someone who knew Maybelle's real name. And they were getting closer. Spring came late that year, as if the land itself hesitated to wake. But when it did, the thaw crept in gently, melting the frost from the fence posts, softening the ground beneath Maybelle's boots, drawing green from the brown hills like something coaxing life from grief. It had been 2 months since Elias brought her home. The bunkhouse still smelled faintly of old dust and linseed oil, but Maybelle had made it hers. She lined the shelf with a few books she found in the attic, folded her clothes neatly, even fixed the crooked door hinge that had creaked when the wind blew. There was something sacred about routine, she decided. It didn't erase what you'd done or what had been done to you, but it gave you something to do with your hands. Elias had changed too, though not in any obvious way. He still kept to himself, still wore the same 3 shirts until they frayed, still moved like a man half a step from falling apart. But he started drinking his coffee on the porch again, and more than once Maybelle caught him staring at the fields with something in his eyes that wasn't quite emptiness. He talked now, not much, but enough. One evening while fixing the chicken coop, he asked her if she'd ever had her own room before. She said no, and he didn't ask why. Another time, he showed her the scar on his side, a long pale slash from a bull gone mad when he was 20. "Hurt like hell," he said. Didn't learn a damn thing from it. She laughed, an actual laugh, sharp and quick, and he looked at her like he hadn't heard that sound in a long time. These small moments began to stitch themselves between them like threads pulled tight. He never asked what she was running from. She never asked what had burned in that fire. Maybe it was easier that way. Some truths are like splinters. Dig too deep, and you bleed more than you heal. Still, something shifted between them when they rode out together. Elias had taken to showing her the edges of the property, the creek that ran dry in late summer, the place where the coyotes denayed in the ravine, the grove of cottonwoods where he sometimes went just to be alone. They didn't talk much on those rides, but there was comfort in the silence. One morning, she asked to ride out alone. He hesitated but agreed, handing her his rifle with a nod. She didn't miss the gesture. Trust, even in slivers, meant something. The days got longer. She grew stronger. She learned how to lay fence, how to patch a saddle, how to whistle loud enough to call in the dogs. She began to sleep through the night without waking from nightmares. Not always, but more than before. On Sundays, she walked the property alone and talked out loud to no one in particular, just to hear her own voice. It reminded her she was still here. But even as things warmed between them, there were still edges too sharp to hold. One evening, Elias returned from town with blood on his knuckles. Maybelle asked, and he just muttered. Amos Greeley said something he shouldn't. She didn't press, but later she heard that Amos had told someone she'd been a whore in another life, that she'd tricked Elias into buying her with some sob story. The rumors were getting worse, and Elias had made it clear, in his quiet, dangerous way, that anyone repeating them would regret it. It wasn't just gossip anymore. Someone broke into the barn one night. Nothing stolen, but the horses were spooked and the tack room had been torn apart. Elias didn't call the sheriff. He just sat on the porch all night, shotgun across his lap. Maybelle didn't sleep either. The past, whatever shape it took, was pressing in again. She tried to tell him one night, tried to speak the truth that sat like a stone in her chest. But the words came out in pieces. There was a man, she said, staring at the fire. He owned the house where I was staying. Said I owed him for food, for clothes, for being kept. Her voice cracked, but she didn't stop. He said I could work it off, but not with chores. She looked up, eyes dry but burning. I ran, took a little money, and got out. Elias didn't say anything at first, just leaned forward and threw another log on the fire. It cracked and hissed in the flames. Then he spoke low and rough. You did what you had to do. She wanted to believe that, but it still felt like stealing, like surviving had cost her something she hadn't even named yet. From then on, their silence carried more weight. Not uncomfortable, but full. Shared. Some mornings they'd sit on the porch together, sipping bitter coffee and watching the sun break over the ridge. She told him about her brother, dead from a fever when she was 10. He told her about his daughter, how she used to sing to the chickens. He said her name was Ruth. That was the first time he'd said it out loud in years. It came out like a confession. She reached over and put her hand on his. He didn't pull away, but nothing good stays still for long. The sheriff showed up one afternoon, hat in hand, asking to speak with Elias. Maybelle stayed in the barn, listening from behind the door. Got word from Lubbock, the sheriff said. Some Pinkertons came through asking about a girl named Annabelle Tate. Said she ran off with a purse full of money and left a man near dead. Elias didn't answer. Sheriff sighed. I know it's her, Elias. I ain't blind, but I also know you, and I know you don't bring folks into your home without a reason. So I'm a skin. What do I do here? Elias looked past him, toward the barn. Toward her. She's not who they think, he said. Whatever she did, she's not that anymore. That was the most he'd said in one breath in over a year. The sheriff gave him a long, tired look. I'll give you some time, but this won't stay quiet forever. When he rode off, Elias didn't come looking for her. He let her stay in the barn until dark. She sat there for hours, hands clenched around the edge of the feed bin, trying not to fall back into that feeling of being hunted. She thought about running again, packing what little she had, and slipping into the night. But when she looked out and saw Elias sitting on the porch, just sitting, not watching her, not calling her name, she stayed. Later, he left the door to the bunkhouse open. No words, just a sign. She stepped inside and shut it behind her. The next morning, they rode out to mend the southern fence. She worked beside him with steady hands, like nothing had changed. But everything had. You knew, she said quietly. driving a post into the ground. He nodded. Since the third day. She didn't ask why he hadn't turned her in. Didn't need to. Instead, she asked, "Do you think I'm dangerous?" He looked at her a long time before answering. "No," he said, "but I think someone made you think you had to be." The wind picked up. Clouds rolled low across the hills. She felt a sting behind her eyes, but blinked it away. They kept working. The danger wasn't gone. It was closer now, with a name and a trail. But so was something else. Something Maybelle hadn't known she could feel again. She trusted him. Not in the way a child trusts an adult. Not even the way a woman might trust a man. She trusted him the way survivors trust each other, with the knowledge that both of them had been broken, and both had chosen to stay instead of run. And Elias, he had stopped waiting to die. He didn't say it, didn't need to. It was in the way he walked the land now, more grounded. The way he looked at her, like she wasn't something he'd found, but someone who had come back from somewhere dark. They weren't saved. Not yet. But they were trying. And that was something. The first storm of the season rolled in with no warning. The sky cracked open just after dusk, thunder booming across the hills like gunfire. Elias and Maybelle had just finished feeding the horses when the rain came, sudden and hard. By the time they ran back to the bunkhouse, both were soaked to the bone, boots squelching with every step. Maybelle laughed breathlessly, wiping the wet hair from her eyes. Elias just watched her, the corner of his mouth lifting in a rare flicker of something like peace. But the moment passed fast. There was always something waiting. 3 days later, Sheriff Langston came back. This time, he wasn't alone. The two men with him wore dark coats and hard eyes. Pinkerton agents, as clean and cold as bone. The taller one, Riggs, had a scar down his cheek and a voice like splintered wood. The other, Monroe, said little, but looked at Maybelle like he already knew what she was going to say before she opened her mouth. They didn't arrest her, not yet. So they just needed to clarify a few things. But the pressure in the room was sharp enough to taste. Elias stood behind her the whole time, silent as stone, arms crossed, jaw locked. Riggs laid out simple. A man named Felix Danton in El Paso had accused Maybelle, under the name Annabelle Tate, of stealing a lockbox from his estate and leaving him half dead. Claimed she poisoned his drink, fled with over $2,000, and vanished. Maybelle's voice didn't shake when she answered. He drugged me, locked me in his house for 6 weeks, told me I'd never leave unless it was in a box. I took what I could and ran. Monroe's lip twitched. That true. Danton never pressed charges until 2 months ago. Real convenient timing. Maybelle stared at them. He didn't think I'd survive long enough to talk. They left her with a warning. The charges were real, the man still breathing. And if she didn't come willingly, they'd be back with shackles. Langston looked ashamed as he followed them out. But he didn't defend her. He didn't even look at her. When they were gone, Elias finally spoke. You didn't have to tell them the truth. Maybelle shook her head, voice tight. It was time. But what neither of them said out loud was that time was running out. She was no longer just a runaway girl. She was a name on a list, a story told too many different ways. If Danton had power, and he did, then it was only a matter of days before things got worse. That night, Maybelle sat on the porch while Elias repaired a broken latch on the barn. She watched the horizon, her shoulders drawn tight. For the first time since arriving, she looked unsure. Not of Elias, or even herself, but of whether she could keep going, whether this second chance had been real or just borrowed. I can leave, she said as he approached, voice quiet. I won't bring it down on you. Elias stood in the doorway for a long moment, then stepped onto the porch, boots thudding against the wood. He sat beside her. I lost everything trying to protect what I had, he said. My wife, my daughter, I couldn't save them. But this time I got the chance to stand for someone, and I won't throw it away because it's hard. She didn't cry. Neither of them were the crying type anymore. But she reached over and took his hand, and he didn't pull away. The next complication came from the South Ridge. A ranch hand, young, jumpy, loyal to Amos Greeley, spotted Elias and Maybelle embracing in the field behind the barn one morning. By sundown, Amos had spread the word across half the county. The girl wasn't just hiding from the law, she'd sunk her claws into Elias to buy his silence. Soon after, two of Elias's ranch hands quit without warning. Said they didn't want trouble. One of them muttered something about not working for a whore in hiding. Maybelle heard it. She didn't flinch. But that night, she went down to the creek alone and stayed there until moonrise. Elias found her sitting on the bank, barefoot, hands in the cold water. "I'm not ashamed," she said without turning around. "But I'm tired of being what people make of me." "You're not that," he said. "Not to me." She nodded, but her voice was far away. "It's not enough to just survive, is it?" "No," Elias said, "but it's a start." Over the next week, things tightened around them like rope pulled taut. Riggs returned, this time with a writ. He said they had 3 days to hand Maybelle over before they came with force. Maybelle said nothing. She packed a small bag and left it by the door. Elias found her practicing with a rifle behind the barn, aiming at fence posts with steady hands. He didn't tell her to stop. They both knew what was coming. On the second night, Sarah Langley appeared at the ranch with a letter. She handed it to Maybelle, her face drawn and unreadable. "It's from someone in El Paso," she said. The letter was from a woman named Rosa Montiel, who had worked as a housemaid for Felix Danton for 6 years. She had seen what he did to Maybelle, heard the screams, the threats, the drunken promises that no one would ever believe a girl like her. Rosa wrote that she had finally found the courage to speak out. She told the local priest, and the story had started to spread. Quietly, but it was moving. Maybelle's hands trembled as she read it. It wasn't proof, but it was hope. "Someone's listening," she whispered. That night, she and Elias sat in the dark and talked about the things they'd never said before. He told her how he'd been the one to leave the lantern in the barn that night, the one that started the fire. How he'd carried that guilt every day, waking and sleeping. "I thought maybe if I stayed alone long enough, I'd stop remembering." She touched his face gently. "And did you?" He looked at her. "No, but you made me want to remember something else, too." They kissed, soft and trembling, not with heat, but with recognition. The kind of kiss that says, "I see you, and I'm not afraid." But love wasn't enough to stop what came the next morning. The Pinkertons arrived before sunrise for this time. Armed, quiet, professional. Monroe stayed back, but Riggs stepped forward and handed Elias the final notice. "We're talking her now," he said, "and you best not try to stop it." Elias stepped between them. "She has a witness. The story's coming out." Riggs sneered, then let the court decide. Maybelle stepped forward, placing a hand on Elias's back. "Let me go," she said. "I'll fight this the right way." But Elias's jaw clenched. There is no right way. Then came the crack of a rifle. Everyone froze. A single shot had hit the dirt just inches from Riggs's boots. From the hill above, Harlan Kemp stood, rifle raised. "She don't go nowhere," he called, "until that girl's got a damn lawyer." Behind him, Sarah Langley appeared on horseback, holding a folder of papers. "We filed an injunction in Austin. You try and take her now, and it'll be you breaking the law." The Pinkertons looked around. The tide had turned, if only slightly. Monroe rode forward, whispered something to Riggs, and the lead agent finally spat in the dirt. "You bought yourself time," he said, "but it won't hold." They turned and rode out. Elias let out a breath that shook his chest. Maybelle stood beside him, not smiling, not crying, just solid, like stone tempered by fire. The setbacks hadn't crushed them. Not yet, but they had burned away all illusions. Now, they knew who they were up against, what they were fighting for, and they knew the cost if they failed. The sun had barely crested the hills when word came that Felix Danton had arrived in town. He'd taken up a room at the Grand Millstone Hotel, the biggest and oldest building in the county. 3 stories of polished wood, lace curtains, and the quiet stink of old money. Word spread fast, too fast. By noon, everyone from the feed store boys to the schoolteacher's wife knew he was here. That he'd come not just with lawyers, but with fire in his belly. Felix wasn't content to let court settle things. He wanted to bury Maybelle in the dirt she'd crawled from, and he wanted the town to watch. Elias stared at the newsprint in his hand. The headline in the county paper read, "Businessman Pursues Fugitive Justice." Maybelle's name was right beneath, followed by the old one she hadn't used since she fled El Paso, Annabelle Tate. She didn't flinch when he showed it to her. Her face was pale but steady. She'd been waiting for this moment, dreading it, preparing for it in silence. But now that it was here, something inside her hardened. She wasn't going to hide anymore. "I want to talk to him," she said. Elias's fist tightened around the paper. "You owe that man nothing." "I need to look him in the eye," she said quietly. "So I know he doesn't own any part of me anymore." Elias didn't answer right away. The silence between them was thick, but not cold. Just full of everything that couldn't be said all at once. "I'll be there," he said finally. "But you do this on your terms, not his." That night, the streets felt different. Quiet, but not peaceful. Everyone was watching, but no one said a word. The saloon had emptied by 8, the curtains in the windows drawn tight. People wanted justice, or a spectacle, or maybe just a story to tell their grandkids. None of them really knew the truth. None of them had lived it. Maybelle walked through the center of town in a plain brown dress, hair braided back, eyes straight ahead. Elias walked beside her, every muscle in his body ready to strike if he had to. Behind them, Sarah Langley followed with Rosa Montiel, who had arrived from El Paso with a small satchel and a spine made of steel. She wore her best shawl and carried her testimony like a blade. Felix was already waiting in the hotel parlor, lounging in a high-back chair with 2 of his lawyers on either side. He looked thinner than Maybelle remembered, but not weak. His suit was pressed, his shoes shined, his teeth yellow behind a serpent's grin. "Well," he said, rising. "Annabelle Tate. All grown up. My name is Maybelle Carrick now," she replied. "And I'm not here for your games." His eyes narrowed at that. "You cost me a great deal, girl. My money, my reputation. You nearly cost me my life." Felix's voice dropped. "You think anyone's going to believe a whore over a man of business? You ran off with my savings, drugged me. Because you were keeping me prisoner," she snapped. "You lured me in with promises of work. You beat me. You starved me. And when I finally escaped, I took what I needed to survive." One of the lawyers tried to interrupt, but Rosa stepped forward, voice strong. "I was in that house. I cleaned the blood from her mouth. I heard her scream behind locked doors. I beg you to stop." Felix turned on Rosa, furious. "You're lying." But Rosa didn't move. "No, I'm just not afraid anymore." Elias stepped forward, placing himself between Maybelle and Felix. "You're done, Danton. You'll never touch her again." "You don't scare me," Felix growled. "I've got the law on my side." Sarah Langley pulled a paper from her coat pocket. "Not anymore. Rose's testimony is already in the hands of a district judge. And with 2 witnesses and a filed injunction, the court has no choice but to open an investigation. You came here expecting a lynching. What you'll get is a trial." Felix's face turned red, then white. His lawyer stiffened, clearly not expecting this. "You think this changes anything?" he hissed. "You think anyone cares what happens to a girl like her?" Elias's voice was low, dangerous. "I do." And for the first time, Felix Danton faltered. Maybelle looked him in the eye, her voice quiet but steady. "You kept me afraid for too long. You convinced me I'd never be more than what you made me. But I survived you, and now the world will know what you are." She turned and walked out, her shoulders straight. Elias followed, Rosa and Sarah behind them. The hotel parlor fell into silence behind them, the weight of what had just unfolded settling like dust after a storm. Outside, the night was cold. Maybelle paused on the porch, breathing in the air like it was her first taste of freedom. For the first time, she wasn't running. She'd stood her ground. They walked back through the quiet town, and people watched from behind curtains, some nodding silently, others just staring. Maybe they didn't understand. Maybe they never would. But Maybelle no longer needed them to. The next morning, she and Elias rode out to the ridge where the fence needed mending. It wasn't symbolic. It was just the work that needed doing. But something about it felt different now, like rebuilding a world they both thought they'd lost. At midday, they stopped under the cottonwood tree and shared a lunch of bread and apples. Elias leaned back against the trunk, watching the clouds shift overhead. "You were brave last night," he said. "I was scared the whole time," she replied. "That's how I know you were brave." She smiled a little. "Do you ever think about starting over? Somewhere else?" He was quiet for a long time before answering. "I did, for a while. But now I think maybe I don't need to leave to feel like I've begun again." Maybelle nodded. "I feel that too." They didn't speak again for a while, just sat together as the wind passed through the grass. But the peace didn't mean the fight was over. The trial would come. Danton would claw back with whatever power he had left. The Pinkertons might return, or worse. But now, Maybelle wasn't facing it alone, and she wasn't hiding. That night, back at the ranch, she found a letter tucked beneath her pillow. It was from Rosa, who had decided to return to El Paso and take her own stand there. "If we don't speak, they win," Rosa had written, "and I've had enough of silence." Maybelle read it twice, tears slipping down her cheeks, quiet and steady. Not from fear, not even from sorrow, but from something that felt dangerously close to hope. Elias found her outside later, standing by the fence line, watching the stars. "You all right?" he asked. She turned to him, eyes glistening. "I think maybe I will be." He stepped beside her, wrapped an arm around her shoulders. They stood like that for a long time, beneath the vast sky. The past wasn't gone. The pain hadn't disappeared. But they had chosen to face it, and that choice had cracked something open. For the first time in years, Elias felt the weight of guilt begin to lift. And Maybelle, no longer defined by her scars, felt something blooming in the hollow places the hurt had left behind. Not all stories end with justice. Not all wounds heal. But in that quiet, starlit moment, they both found something real, something worth staying for. And for now, that was enough. The land had turned soft again by spring. The frost had eased its grip, and wildflowers crept through the old fence posts like little prayers stitched into the earth. The cattle were calving, the creek was running clean, and the ranch, battered but not broken, breathed like something alive. Maybelle rose each morning before the sun, not out of fear or habit, but because she could. She walked the length of the pasture with a notebook in her hand, sketching fence lines and jotting down feed notes. She'd taken over the books from Elias, and though she still stumbled through some of the numbers, she was learning. Slowly, steadily, with a kind of quiet pride she never thought she'd feel again. Elias had started coming into the house more. At first, just for meals, then to fix a broken hinge or sharpen her knives. One night, without speaking, he brought a small wooden box to her table. Inside was the broken locket she'd lost during the worst winter, repaired, polished, and shining like it never had before. Inside were two tiny photos, one of her mother and one of Maybelle, taken just last month by the Langley girl with a camera borrowed from the schoolhouse. Maybelle traced the hinge with her finger, heart caught somewhere between tears and awe. "You remembered," she whispered. He only nodded. But that small act, a locket mended and returned, meant more than any grand confession. It was his way of saying he saw her, all of her, and wasn't afraid. The trial had ended weeks before. Danton's charges stuck, though not all of them. He wouldn't serve life, but he wouldn't be free either. More importantly, the story had been told. Truth laid bare in a courtroom, not hidden behind shame or money. Rosa testified, strong as stone. Sarah Langley sat behind Maybelle every day, never speaking, just steady like a rock in a storm. The town watched in stunned silence, then in slow awakening. By the time it was over, no one looked at Maybelle the same. And more importantly, she no longer looked at herself the same. On the ranch, life went on. Repairs were made. Calves were branded. Neighbors came around more often, some with pie, others with offers to help mend roofs or dig wells. No one brought up the auction anymore. It hung in the past, like a ghost that had finally been named and let go. One warm evening, Elias stood by the barn, watching the sky turn orange. Maybelle came up behind him, brushing hay from her sleeves. "I've been thinking," she said. "Dangerous habit," he replied, but with a smile. "I want to open the ranch up to girls like I was. Ones with nowhere to go." He didn't answer right away, just studied the horizon. Then he nodded once. "We've got land, and beds, and enough strength between us to carry someone else a while." That was all she needed. They started slow. One girl arrived from out near Pecos, 15, wild-eyed, silent as dusk. Then another from a mission house in Santa Fe. Maybelle taught them to ride, to mend clothes, to go to fish. Elias showed them how to hammer a fence post straight and how to listen to a horse before touching its reins. Neither of them talked about saving anyone. They just offered space, a chance, a bit of peace. Some stayed, some didn't. That was all right. On a late afternoon in June, the ranch held a small gathering. Nothing formal, just neighbors and hands and a few of the town girls playing fiddle near the porch. Maybelle wore her hair down, something she hadn't done in years. She moved through the crowd like someone unafraid to take up space. Elias found her by the apple tree. He didn't speak at first, just reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver ring. Simple, unpolished, made from a horseshoe nail he'd shaped by hand. "It ain't much," he said, voice rough with nerves. "But it's yours if you want it." Maybelle looked at him, then at the ring. Her heart didn't leap. It settled, like a bird finding home. She took the ring and slid it on. "I do," she said simply. They didn't make an announcement. There was no wedding march, just a long look shared beneath the tree. Two people who had earned every inch of the peace they now held. Later that night, after the laughter died down and the stars crept into the sky, Maybelle sat by the window, notebook open in her lap. She wrote slow, careful lines about the day, about the girls, the music, the ring. She didn't write about pain, not because it was gone, but because it no longer needed to take center stage. Elias came in, sat beside her, hands calloused and warm. "You tired?" he asked. "No," she said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Just grateful." The wind moved outside, rustling the grass and the last petals of the wildflowers. Life wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was theirs now, full of scars, stitched with love, and still unfolding like something new. And that was enough.